What I'm actually talking about is research that was carried out by somebody else, by another person. Mark Geddes carried out research as part of an MSc in spatial planning in DIT a number of years ago, and it was directly into gender and cycling use. So I was asked by Miriam and Damien to present this. Mark is in New Zealand now. He went there not long after this. And it was very relevant research at the time. It's maybe a little bit old now, but actually thinking about it, it's not as old as the government data. So it's still relevant. Mark carried out, as part of the research, it was mixed method, which was very good. He carried out a survey of almost 1,000 office workers in Dublin City, and he also carried out focus group research. And it really indicated some really some paramount safety issues, but also deeply ingrained cultural and perceptual factors. But it also said that there's hope that actually there's potential to address the gender gap. And the question was asked: can we change not can we change gender attitudes, but how can we actually do it? So I'm very pleased to be presenting this research, and Mark was very helpful to provide some input into it as well. So this is what we're here to talk about, and it's been mentioned a few times today. And this is from the 2006 census, which says that the gender gap is approximately 4-to-1 in Dublin back in 2006. And in 2009 we had the National Travel Survey, which said that nationally it was 2-to-1. But those figures were actually put in brackets. They actually said it was over such a small amount that it was a very, very small sample. We hope to get new data in around December of this year. The 2011 census report will be out, so we'll finally get an up-to-date figure on that. So maybe it's timely to get this data out now and discuss it. So just breaking that down a little bit and asking the question: is this across all age groups? And actually, there's a drop once you get to secondary school, and this has been mentioned already by Teresa and others, that actually in all age categories, the female participation is lower than males, but it's actually most chronic at school going level, even while cycling actually goes up momentarily for males. And there's been other research by Pádraig Ryan and other people who actually studied the transition from primary to secondary, and there were barriers in that to do with the uniform, to do with the amount of books being carried, to do with image. So that transition from primary to secondary is a crucial point. And the trend has not been very, very good. Hopefully, maybe in this census we'll actually see a reversal. We might actually see for the first time participation going up. But it's been going down since 1986. And if you look at 1986 over on the left, actually the situation wasn't that bad at that point. Female participation was 37% overall, and the overall numbers of cyclists were nearly 150,000. And remember, at that point, the population of the country with 3.6 million people, so there's nearly 1 million more people in Ireland now since then. Our population has gone up, the number of trips has gone up, the number of trips per person has gone up, but cycling trips have fallen, and as it's fallen, the gender gap has increased. So if women aren't travelling by bike, how are they travelling? That's a question that's worth asking. And some of the results, again, from the 2006 data are interesting. Pedestrian mode share is actually higher. So active travel has a higher mode share. For public transport, there's about parity, but it's actually higher for bus. Car driver, it's lower. Car passenger, it's higher. Okay. But cycling, it's well below. So I think there's something interesting between these two figures here, between the pedestrian and the cyclist. And actually, if you look at data from the Quadrant National Household Survey, which actually looked at exercise profiles, and I don't know whether Teresa agrees with this or finds this useful, but it actually looks like females are more active than males. And that might be counterintuitive. We hear an awful lot about how girls tend to drop out of active exercise in schools more so than boys, particularly during the teenage years. But it really looks like actually it's men that really fall off in their mid-30s once the competitive aspect of activity is gone. So if women are keen to walk more and keen to exercise more, why aren't they cycling more? So what are the reasons for that? And also in the research by Mark, he looked at other countries and he said, is this expected? Well, yes and no. And there's a pretty clear-cut difference between what you might term as Anglophonic cultures and the rest, the Northern European, if you look at those specifically. And in those countries, and again, we've talked about this already, there's a very, very strong gender balance. It's about parity in some of those countries. And in the Irish, the New Zealand, the Australian, the American, the Canadian countries, it's not very good at all. So what's going on there? Okay. And what else is noticeable about that? Well, actually, in the countries where the gender balance is okay, where it's good, well, that's where you have the critical mass. If you look in the red, the cycling mode share in these same countries is actually quite high. Canada is a slight anomaly there because we saw that the gender balance was actually okay in Canada among cyclists. That appears to be down to one or two particular cities, Vancouver in particular, which has a very, very different urban structure, kind of similar through some, you might say enlightened planning policies. It's more similar to the compact Northern European city model. So why is this? And looking into the literature on this, you find some fairly significant cultural and historical inhibitors to female cycle participation. Giddens, the sociologist, believes that there's no biological evidence for what's referred to as psychosocial gender differences. That this is a factor of conditioning. And it's to do with social norms that have been generated around ideas or notions of masculinity and femininity and appropriate behaviour thereof. And this leads to other things, so that there has been historical records of discrimination. In the earlier years of cycling in the 19th century, when cycling was just beginning, there was overt discrimination. Cycling was actually banned in many countries for a long time for women. And also, the earliest bikes were things like these that was actually made to emulate horse riding at this sort of time when women could only ride. Well, it was only acceptable to ride side saddle because of appropriate attire. In exercise habits, and I think we'll hear a little bit more about this, cycling only became an accepted exercise sport very late in the 20th century. It only became an Olympic sport in the 1980s, I think. Is that, yeah, I think thereabouts. But certainly, 100 years after was completely acceptable for men. And also attitudes, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this later, attitudes and promotion, I don't think has actually developed very much at all over time. And I think some of the promotional attitudes towards cycling in general media have not actually moved on a lot since the time that this guy was on his bike. Okay, so looking at our survey, and we've also got blue and red. I think it's the default that pops up. So this is the result of the survey carried out by Mark. And he went to about 8 workplaces in Dublin, and he got a total of just under 1,000 responses. And he asked, there's a lot of data here, so I've tried to pick out the salient or more interesting stuff. So general attitudes and perceptions towards cycling. On balance, men are more positive than women about cycling, and on balance, women are more negative than men towards cycling. That's general attitudes. So there is a bias against cycling in the record. And asking people, would you consider this is targeted directly at non-cyclists? And about 2/3 of the respondents were non-cyclists. Would you consider cycling to work occasionally? And again, there was a more favourable response from men than from women. But later on, we'll see when we actually get into the focus group research, we find out that this is actually very contextual and can be altered, and that there's obvious reasons for this that can be gotten over or can be addressed. So a clear question, is Dublin safe for cycling? Not really, and some people think it is, but again, it's similar to our 4-to-1. It's about 4-to-1, say cycling is safe. And that's interesting when we actually meet people and ask them about that and get into the reasons why. Now, apologies for the lots of data here. But people are asked, non-cyclists were asked, what are your reasons for not cycling? And myself, Mark, I remember actually looking at this and working out what's the best way to represent this. At least it's all the one colour, but it would be better for this one, but it's quite hard to do it. But essentially, if you look, there is a trend, and both males and females' reasons are actually very, very similar. But the tendency is for women to actually be more sensitive to these issues. So, and the main issues at the bottom: traffic concerns, driver aggression, poor weather, security concerns, too far to cycle. So safety is a really, really key thing here. And the level of sensitivity to it is very, very high for both genders, but more so for women. So looking at the difference between males and females, and let's look at the top 5 there. So the level of sensitivity difference, again, it's safety. Safety is a huge concern. Security concerns, driver aggression. I'm not going to use the word assertiveness here. I'm going to call it driver aggression. Maybe that's using language. Lack in cycling ability, traffic concerns, and lack of route knowledge. So maybe 2 key things there on the top. So safety and also ability. So being used to cycling comes up as an issue. And then looking at the, and I think this is the cyclists, I beg your pardon. So this is reasons for cycling. It has to be. So the benefits, and there's a stronger positive bias generally towards these issues. So exercise and health, combining exercise and transport, and that's something that was mentioned by Teresa, the opportunity to actually incorporate your active travel into everyday life. The convenience of it, avoiding traffic, and the flexibility and independence of it. And interestingly, the motivations to cycle were practically the same for men and women. But again, the motivations were greater for women. So there was this willingness, and that maybe reflects back to women's higher exercise rate that we saw earlier, and higher participation rate in walking. So top 4 the same, but more so for women. So they're very, very interested in cycling. They're just not going to do it, and there's particularly strong reasons for that. And just to complete that, we asked the cyclists what your reason to cycle is, and a similar set of results. Okay, so Mark asked a lot of questions about what would motivate you to cycle, what particular, I'm not going to go through all of them, because there is a lot of data here, and I want to get on to the actual focus group when we started actually talking to people. But broadly, measures that would actually create a safer environment for cycling were very, very positively received for both genders, but in particular, off-road routes and segregated routes were of particular interest from the female point of view, because it's going to increase or deal with the danger issue. Okay, so now when we got into the focus group research, when Mark did, we actually started to tend towards a different issue, and the issue of image actually came up, and some really, really interesting and nuanced things started to come out of that. Generally from both groups, and I'm going to talk about both groups in terms of cyclists and non-cyclists. Mark carried out 2 focus groups. One was with a group of men, and the other one was with a group of women. And in each group there was cyclists and non-cyclists. Thanks very much. Okay. So generally there was a very positive attitude to cycling for both groups. There was a big prejudice about the weather among non-cyclists. And there was the interplay between cyclists and non-cyclists was very, very interesting. Actually, when challenged about the fact that the weather actually comparatively isn't that bad in Dublin, it actually started to change people's perceptions. So people were willing to have the perceptions changed. On the danger issue, male cyclists actually had this cavalier attitude that, yeah, it's dangerous out there, but, you know, I can deal with that. But all cyclists that were out there actually mitigated against the danger in some way. They said, I can take a different route, I can travel at a different time, or I can deal with it, I can wear the right attire, but it doesn't matter to me. I keep on cycling, I like cycling in spite of the danger. Experience and training was an issue, some of the participants in the women's group admitted to not having cycled since their school, and that was a barrier, so there was a reluctance to start at any time. But the big issue was image, and for both genders as well, in different ways. And it was particularly for the non-cyclists, so they had perceptions about cycling that was stopping them from cycling, which the cyclists didn't have at all. They were very comfortable with the self-image, and in fact they thought that it was good for they saw it as a good thing generally. But in the other group you had things like, cycling is gonna, I'm not gonna look my best, words like inept, been seen by neighbours and colleagues. So people had a fear about this. It might be okay once you met your partner, but certainly not before that. Logistical problems of makeup, hairdryer, hair products, fair enough. So, all these things, what are they pointing towards? Is it the attitude of the office, the environment of the office? A very interesting perspective was one professional woman who said, it's enough of a struggle to get respect as it is. So I'm certainly not going to start cycling because that's going to make my problem worse. And at that point, some of the cyclists said, well, actually, a lot of this depends on the attitude at work, what type of environment or office you're in. Men had particular attachments to the car, in particular this came up, and it was to do with status, it was to do with return on investment. I've spent so much money on this. It was to do with sex appeal. But the constraints, when people had barriers to cycle, it was always multifactorial. So there was always this range of issues that were being thrown up. So it was very, very perceptual and very, very deeply ingrained. So a couple of images were actually thrown at the user group. What type of images would you think would be most effective in encouraging you to cycle? I don't know what, I'll just go through the different types. So you had attractive model cycling. So these are actually taken from the Copenhagenized blog. You had sort of normal people cycling, the Australians, I think, the lycra-clad Australians, not in the pile up here. People cycling of all ages, social backgrounds and ethnicity, and people wearing cycle safety gear and clothing. And almost universally, unanimously, it was this group up here. That's what people wanted to see, and that's what would attract them to cycling the most. And in the focus groups, there were positives towards cycling as well. So, especially from the cyclists, the idea that it creates social opportunities. That's something that Damien's very, very strong about. This idea of competition was actually very, very strong, especially among the male group. Okay? And I know Elaine Brick won't be a little bit surprised at that. But a lot of people said, yeah, I like the idea of racing, I like the idea of competitiveness in my daily cycle. But always the interplay between cyclists and non-cyclists was interesting. So once people's negative perceptions were challenged, they're willing to change them. And again, where women appeared most inhibited or most sensitive to issues, they also appeared the most open to change once new information was presented to them. So, and I think I have to finish up very soon. Okay. So what does this mean in terms of actually, trying to promote cycling and to actually market? Well, what we know about cycling is that it's it's a narrow cohort. It's largely middle class, young to middle aged, and male. And the female cohort, we find from this body of research, I think, it's one of several excluded cohorts, but it's highly strategic. But we're not going to be able to promote the product unless it's a quality product. There's built up perceptual issues about it, but we're not going to be able to address that unless we actually have something good to sell. So women, again, they're most sensitive here, but the greatest opportunity for change is here. So if we can actually tackle or target that market, that's going to be the most positive thing. And the brand has to present what people want. And I'd actually ask the question, who's responsible for communicating this message? And are there counter messages been distributed? And I want to finish on just two things. This is what I would refer to as marketing perfidias. These are two stills from an ad, and you can actually look it up yourself. I'm not going to show it here now. It's about a 30-second ad. It's for a Nissan Juke car. And how they actually portray both active travel and public transport, I find quite extraordinary. And this is the Copenhagenized blog throws up a lot of these, and you see that marketing for cars is becoming more and more threatened by public transport and walking, cycling. And active travel is made to look deeply unattractive, like a chore, very, very unstylish, very unsexy, almost androgynous. You might find it hard to say, you know, is this a man or a woman? Just completely unattractive. And public transport, you actually have a rat getting on to the tram. This is filmed in Hamburg. So what's that saying? We don't have to read too much between the lines there. What's that saying about public transport? And we have advertising standards for things like alcoholic drinks. We have it for food, we have it for children's toys, we have it for slimming products. So there's controls on negative advertising for things that are damaging to our health and also costly to us if we're spending money on social welfare and on health. You know, should advertisers be allowed to negatively portray these things? And the last thing I'm going to say, because I know we're very, very tight on time, just to refer back, if we're going to market something, it has to be a good product. This is data about the canal crossing, the canal cordon count, taken back over the last 5 or 6 years, and it's great that we have this data. But I'm just going to knock out the top line there, which is all public transport, because they're there anyway. And if you take that out, you can see that the top line is the car. And if you take a 3-point moving average on that, it's been fairly static. Now, I know we're at capacity, and it's very well to say we can't let any more cars in. That's got to go down if other things have got to go up. And cycling is going up, but it's still very, very low. We really have to do something about that. Dublin City wants to get above 20% by 2020, wants to get up to maybe even 25%. Very, very good. But to do that, we've actually got to challenge some of the other things out there. And before we do that, we're not going to be able to really portray a positive image of cycling in the way that we want. The last word is to some Dubliners, and this was generally from people who cycle and don't cycle, and what they said about marketing cycling is that promoting cycling should be like promoting anything else. It should be made to look stylish and sexy and cool. And if we can do that, then we have a successful city. So thank you very much.